There is a tuning fork sitting in the British Library that once belonged to Ludwig van Beethoven. When it vibrates, it lands at 455.4 hertz. Not 440, not 432, not any of the frequencies people argue about online today. It holds a pitch almost nobody alive is campaigning for, which is exactly what makes it so interesting. Because every piano in every major concert hall on Earth is now tuned to a standard Beethoven never used. His tuning fork survives behind glass like a fossil from a lost acoustic world. A relic from a sound modern civilization quietly abandoned. And that matters for one reason above all. Beethoven's pitch was not some strange exception. It was normal for his time. What sounds standard to us today would likely have sounded off to him. Dull, flat, wrong. The frequency we inherited was not discovered like gravity or fire. It was selected, and everything that came before it was gradually pushed out of the physical world. If you watched my last video about the hundreds of thousands of bells destroyed across Europe, then you already know what happened to the metal. This video is about something more difficult to see. What those bells were actually carrying. Not the bronze, not the raw material that states said they needed for war or industry. The frequency. Each bell held a specific pitch, shaped by founders whose techniques were passed down through generations. Father to son, workshop to workshop, town to town. That sound is gone now. And the story of how it vanished feels far more deliberate than most people realize. Before 1711, there was no dependable way to measure pitch. No tuning forks, no digital references, no international agreement about what an A was supposed to be. Every community tuned its instruments to whatever its most important local instrument happened to produce, usually the church organ. And those organs varied wildly. Two churches in the same city might be separated by nearly a semitone. A musician traveling from Paris to Vienna could not simply arrive and play. He would have to retune. Sometimes everything. That was not disorder. That was normal. That was the natural condition of sound for most of human history. Every place had its own acoustic identity. The bell in your town rang at a pitch specific to your town. The organ in your cathedral resonated at a frequency that matched the stone, the vaults, the dimensions of the interior. The choir tuned to the organ. The congregation tuned to the choir. The whole sonic life of a community vibrated inside a range that belonged to that place and nowhere else. And we have surviving physical proof of how different those pitches really were. A tuning fork associated with Handel, dated to around 1740, measures about 422.5 hertz. Another surviving fork from around 1780 sits near 409. Beethoven's, around 1800, reaches 455.4. That is a spread of roughly 46 hertz over about 60 years. And these were not obscure musicians on the fringes of Europe. These were central figures. French cathedral organs in the 19th century could run so low that their A dropped into the 370s. The Royal Philharmonic in London shifted from about 433 to 455 between the 1820s and the 1850s. Highland pipe bands, even now, still play much higher, often around 470 to 480. So the idea that there was once one ancient, natural, universal frequency waiting to be recovered is simply not true. Before the modern age, there was no single standard. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, and each one was tied to a place, a building, a bell. Then the state stepped in. On February 16th, 1859, the French government passed a law. Not a recommendation, not a best practice, a law. It declared that the A above middle C would vibrate at 435 hertz across France. This was the diapason normal. For the first time in recorded history, a national government legally fixed the pitch of music. Pause on that for a second. A country that had spent decades tearing itself apart over liberty, citizenship, monarchy, revolution, and the rights of man also decided it needed to legislate the vibration rate of a musical note. That alone should make you stop. And the law did not stay in France. In 1885, a conference in Vienna extended 435 hertz across much of Europe. Italy, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Prussia, Saxony, Sweden, and Württemberg all moved toward the same pitch. Sound, which had once been local, was being centralized. But even that was not the end of the story. In 1884, Giuseppe Verdi wrote to the Italian government. He supported the French standard, but he added something fascinating. He said that if the commission believed, for mathematical exigencies, that the pitch should be lowered to 432, he would gladly support that as well. That matters because Verdi was not some fringe mystic. He was probably the most famous opera composer alive. And Italy listened. For a brief moment, the Italian War Ministry, not a conservatory, not a church body, but a military institution, adopted 432 hertz as a national standard. For about a year, Italy officially tuned to a pitch that later generations would romanticize as somehow closer to the mathematical structure of nature. And then it was gone. In 1885, the Vienna Conference, heavily influenced by British delegates, overturned that direction. Italy dropped 432 almost immediately. The frequency Verdi had endorsed, the one the Italian military had formally accepted, disappeared within about a year. No popular vote, no consultation with the wider musical public. The decision was simply reversed. Now this is the point where a lot of people telling this story make a turn into fantasy. They blame the Nazis. They say Joseph Goebbels engineered a 1939 conference in London to impose 440 hertz as a tool of mass psychological manipulation. I spent a long time checking that claim because I wanted to know if it was real. It falls apart. The 1939 conference in London was organized by the British Standards Institute, not the Nazi regime. German delegates were present, yes, but only a few. And none of them was Goebbels. French delegates attended. Italian delegates attended. The countries that conspiracy stories say were excluded were, in fact, represented. I could repeat the myth because it is dramatic. It gives you a villain. It gives you a clean explanation. It also gives you millions of views. But the real history is stranger, and honestly more disturbing, because it does not depend on a single mastermind. It only requires you to pay attention to what was physically destroyed while standards were being imposed. That is where this story becomes harder to dismiss. Because while governments were standardizing pitch, old acoustic reference points were disappearing from the landscape. And not metaphorically, literally. Bell by bell, foundry by foundry, community by community. If a town had once organized its sonic life around a bell cast generations earlier, and that bell was melted down for war, what replaced it would not carry the same pitch. It could not. The old frequency lived in the bronze itself. Destroy the object, and you destroy the reference. And this is where the timeline starts to matter. Long before radio, long before recording, long before international standards committees, power kept doing the same thing to sound. It removed the old instruments first. Then it told everyone what the new standard would be. In the next part, I want to walk you through that timeline carefully, because once you line up the confiscations, the decrees, the wars, and the bell destructions across 3 centuries, the pattern becomes almost impossible to ignore. So let's walk through the timeline that almost nobody lays out in one place. In 1700, after the Battle of Narva, Tsar Peter the Great ordered the confiscation of roughly 100,000 church bells across Russia so they could be recast into cannons. A century later, during the French Revolution, the National Convention passed a decree on July 23, 1793. Every parish in France could keep 1 bell. Only 1. Every other bell was to be removed and melted down. The scale of that destruction is difficult to picture. About 100,000 bells, taken from roughly 60,000 steeples. Around 80% of France's church bells gone in less than 2 years. Then came the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. In Nancy, the bishop authorized every parish in his diocese to surrender all but 1 bell for cannon production. Again, the same logic. Again, the same result. Not just material extracted from a building, but a reference tone erased from a community. Then, the First World War. In Germany, around 44% of all bells were confiscated or destroyed. And then the Soviet Union made the process even more total. Decree 118, issued on December 6, 1929, banned bell ringing and ordered bells throughout the country to be melted down for industrial bronze. The numbers are almost unbelievable. About 99% of Russia's roughly 1 million bells were destroyed. 20 specialized bell foundries closed. Entire lines of hereditary craft ended. Families that had refined bell founding across generations disappeared from the tradition almost overnight. And that part matters just as much as the bells themselves. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed and people tried to revive Russian bell founding, they found that they could not simply resume where history had paused. The knowledge had not been stored in a manual somewhere. It had lived in families, in workshops, in repetition, in touch, in a listening. Once those foundries closed and those lineages ended, the craft had to be rediscovered, almost from nothing. Then the Second World War repeated the pattern on a continental scale. The Nazis confiscated more than 175,000 bells across occupied Europe. More than 150,000 of them were ultimately destroyed. Belgium lost about 2/3 of its bells. British investigators reported that every single bell had been removed from the Netherlands. Only around 300 survived in a warehouse in Hamburg. Now, add all of that together. Across revolutions, decrees, wars, and industrial campaigns spanning 3 centuries, at least 425,000 documented church bells were physically eliminated across Europe. And every one of those bells had been more than a decoration, more than a signal, more than a religious symbol. Each one was a precision acoustic instrument. Each one had a pitch. Each one had been tuned by specialists. Each one acted as a local reference point around which the sound of a town or city organized itself. When the bells were melted, the frequencies went with them. That is the part I keep coming back to. Because every replacement bell cast afterward, every new organ installed afterward, every instrument built into that transformed world, had to follow whatever standard now governed the age. The earlier frequencies did not remain floating in the air, waiting to be recovered. They had existed in material form, in bronze, in resonance, in physical objects that were destroyed and turned into cannons, coins, or industrial stock. And I need to be honest here about something that genuinely bothered me while researching this. I started out expecting to find evidence of coordination, a hidden effort, a deliberate program to remove specific frequencies from human life. A meeting, a policy, a memo, something direct. I did not find that. What I found was, in a way, more unsettling. The French Revolution destroyed bells for one reason. The Soviets destroyed them for another. The Nazis destroyed them for another. Different ideologies, different centuries, different stated goals. And yet, the outcome was identical every time. Ancient acoustic reference systems were physically erased. If this were a simple conspiracy, at least you could point to a mastermind. You could blame a few people in a room. But when the same result keeps appearing under monarchy, revolution, communism, fascism, and industrial bureaucracy, you are looking at something broader than a plot. You are looking at a pattern that centralized power reproduces almost automatically. No matter what flag it flies under, power tends to flatten local systems. It tends to remove what is particular, inherited, place-bound, difficult to regulate. And in the case of sound, that meant bells. Now here is where the story becomes even stranger, because many of the buildings those bells were made for are still standing. The acoustic environments were not destroyed with the bells. The stone survived. And the more researchers study these buildings, the harder it becomes to dismiss the idea that medieval and Byzantine builders were designing for sound in ways we still do not fully understand. In 2016, researchers at universities in Greece used sine wave sweeps to analyze the acoustic properties of 8 Byzantine churches in Thessaloniki. What they found was not accidental. The architects had made deliberate choices based on resonance. Acoustic vases, clay vessels known as amphorae, had been embedded directly into walls and domes to strengthen specific resonant frequencies. These were not ornaments. They were functional acoustic devices built into the architecture itself. That alone should change how you think about old sacred buildings. And it is not an isolated case. At Noyon Cathedral in France, researchers identified an underground chamber called the Caveau Phonocamptique beneath the crossing. It contained an arrangement of acoustic vases designed to amplify sound on a monumental scale. The concept appears to have been inspired by Vitruvius, the Roman architectural writer from the 1st century BC, whose work discussed how vessels could be used to shape resonance in built space. This was not medieval superstition. This was acoustic engineering. The materials mattered too. Builders often selected limestone and other crystalline stone, not just because it was available or visually impressive, but because those materials transmit and amplify sound in distinctive ways. Gothic cathedrals regularly produce reverberation times of 5 to 8 seconds. Orthodox churches vary widely, from about 1.5 seconds in a small village chapel to 6 seconds in a major cathedral. One acoustics researcher studying Orthodox church architecture made a remark that I have not been able to shake. He said these spaces were much better at holding sound than holding people. And he wondered whether the real occupants of the buildings were not the congregations at all, but the painted saints on the walls and the reverberant sound moving through the air. That sounds poetic until you stand inside one of these places and feel how plausible it is. You have probably had that experience yourself. You step into a cathedral or an old stone church and immediately feel something shift. There is a hum beneath conscious thought, a strange sense that the room is not silent, even when nobody is speaking. Tourists describe it. Pilgrims describe it. Even people with no religious commitment describe it. The usual explanation is spiritual, sacred art, sacred history, sacred atmosphere. But maybe the explanation is also mechanical. Maybe these buildings were not just spaces where music happened. Maybe they were instruments themselves. Think about the system as it once functioned. The stone vaults, the proportions, the embedded vases, the reflective surfaces, the material of the walls, all of it calibrated to amplify certain frequencies. Then the bells ringing at those frequencies, the organ tuned to the bells, the choir tuned to the organ, stone amplifying bronze, bronze guiding voice, voice energizing stone. A loop of resonance tied to architecture so tightly that the whole building became part of the sound. Now remove one element, melt the bells, retune the organ, shift the choir to a new standard. What remains? The building remains. The vases remain. The stone remains. The old resonant preferences of the structure remain, but nothing is feeding them anymore. The instrument is still there. Nobody is playing it. In the next part, I want to take that idea further, because once you compare those older resonant buildings to modern churches, modern concert standards, and the debate over 432 versus 440, the real loss starts to come into focus, and it is much bigger than a single number. Modern churches make the loss easier to see because they reveal, by contrast, what older buildings were doing. A lot of contemporary worship spaces are built with completely different materials and completely different assumptions. Drywall instead of stone, carpet instead of marble, suspended ceilings instead of vaults, foam panels instead of crystalline surfaces. The goal is often practical clarity, cost control, and amplified speech. And the result, according to researchers who study church acoustics, is often the same. Spaces that are too dead for singing and too live for speech. High frequencies get swallowed. Low frequencies turn muddy. Everything depends on microphones and speakers to compensate. You can hold a service in a strip mall now. You can project the voice, reinforce the music, and make the room function. But something fundamental changed when architecture stopped participating in the sound itself. The building became a container for amplified audio rather than a partner in resonance. And that difference is not subtle. It is the difference between an instrument and a box. So what was actually lost when hundreds of thousands of bells disappeared? and the Western world gradually accepted a single standardized pitch. Most people frame this debate in the simplest possible way. 432 versus 440. Ancient harmony versus modern manipulation. A natural frequency versus an imposed one. But that framing misses the deeper issue, because there was never one ancient frequency. There were many. Every town, every abbey, every cathedral, every region had its own acoustic center of gravity. Each was shaped by local instruments, local builders, local materials, local ears. What disappeared was not one sacred number. It was an entire ecology of sound. That is the scale of the loss. Each bell was tuned to a place. Each place developed around the bell. The building responded to that pitch. The organ followed it. The choir absorbed it. The people heard it from birth. The sound of home was not abstract. It had a frequency. It had reverberation. It had a local acoustic signature as distinctive as architecture or dialect. And then standardization arrived and flattened all of it. Now, to be clear, I am not claiming that every old local pitch was somehow healthier or more enlightened. I am also not claiming that 432 Hz is magical. A lot of people online want the story to land there because it gives them a clean answer. But the evidence does not support that kind of certainty. What we do have are hints that frequency is not irrelevant to the body. One peer-reviewed study exposed 33 volunteers to music tuned at both 432 and 440 Hz without telling them which version they were hearing. The group listening to 432 showed measurable decreases in heart rate and reported feeling slightly more focused and more satisfied. That is interesting. It is also limited. 33 people is not a large sample, and no serious person should pretend that one small study settles a debate like this. But it does suggest something important. Small shifts in tuning are not necessarily neutral to human experience. And if a change of 8 Hz can produce even modest physiological differences in controlled conditions, then what did it mean when entire communities once lived inside buildings acoustically shaped around stable local frequencies for centuries at a time? What did that do to memory, to ritual, to emotion, to concentration, to the felt atmosphere of a place? That is the question I cannot stop thinking about. Because imagine a cathedral operating as designed. Not as a tourist site, not as a museum, not as a partly restored shell. Imagine it in full acoustic alignment, the bells ringing at the same pitch they had rung for generations, the organ tuned to them, the choir responding to the organ, the stone structure reinforcing those same resonant bands, the congregation standing inside a building that was not merely surrounding the sound, but participating in it. What happened in that environment? What did people actually feel in their bodies when voice, metal, air, and stone all locked into the same acoustic logic? We do not really know anymore. We have measurements. We have reverberation times. We have surviving buildings. We have acoustic vases still embedded in walls that are hundreds of years old. We have research showing that these spaces were deliberately engineered with sonic behavior in mind. We have historical records proving that pitch used to vary dramatically from one place to another. We have surviving tuning forks like Beethoven's, sitting in display cases as evidence that the modern standard is not timeless at all. What we do not have is the full system, because the bells are gone. The founders are gone. The lineages of craft that understood how to match bronze to architecture are mostly gone. And once the physical reference instruments disappeared, the living memory of those local frequencies disappeared with them. That, to me, is the real tragedy in this story. Not that humanity chose the wrong number, but that we lost the principle of local resonance altogether. Every village once had a sound. Every cathedral once had a sonic identity. Every region once occupied its own acoustic world. Standardization did not just make orchestras more convenient. It replaced place-based sound with broadcast sound. And the mechanism of that replacement was not abstract. In 1936, the United States Bureau of Standards began transmitting a 440 Hz reference tone every hour on radio station WWV. Musicians all over the country tuned to it. That is the moment the local reference starts to die in a new way. No longer because a nearby bell defines the pitch of the town, but because a national signal arrives through the air and tells every instrument what it should become. The same pattern repeated across industrial societies. One pitch for every recording studio. One pitch for every concert instrument. One pitch for every conservatory, orchestra, broadcast, and pressing plant. Efficient, scalable, reproducible, and acoustically devastating. Because once sound is standardized at scale, the unique relation between a building and its frequencies no longer matters. The place becomes secondary. The system comes first. So no, I am not arguing that 440 Hz is a weapon. And I am not arguing that switching everything to 432 would somehow restore a lost golden age. That would be too simple, and history is not simple. What I am arguing is something both smaller and bigger. Smaller because this is not about mystical claims I cannot prove. Bigger because it concerns one of the largest acoustic transformations in human history. Over the course of a few centuries, humanity moved from a world of countless local pitch centers to a world of one dominant global standard. And that shift happened alongside the repeated physical destruction of the very objects that had once anchored local sound. Bells, organs, foundries, workshops, traditions. The architecture survived. The frequencies did not, which leaves us with a strange inheritance. Across Europe and beyond, old stone buildings still stand. Their walls still hold the acoustic intentions of the people who built them. Their embedded vessels still shape resonance. Their vaults still return sound in the same long waves. The material memory is still there, but the input changed. The buildings remember what the culture forgot. And maybe that is the question nobody really wants to ask, because it does not produce an easy answer or a clean slogan. Not which frequency is correct, not whether 432 beats 440, but what sound was doing in those places when the bell, the building, and the human voice were all aligned. What happened inside that resonance? What states of feeling, attention, devotion, or perception emerged inside spaces operating exactly as they were designed to operate? We can still measure the stone. We can still map the reverberation. We can still see the acoustic vases in walls 800 years old. We can still document that these structures were built with a level of sonic sophistication we are only beginning to take seriously. But the frequencies that once completed the system melted with the bronze, and almost nobody is asking what they sounded like now, because the people who knew are gone, just like the bells.